off the spectrum in terms of the calamity that's befallen them. Every day is just another day of massacres and slaughter, really. So just on my way here today, there was a massacre near a bakery. And a baby girl, his wife had a baby girl 10 days ago, and he showed me the baby girl in a tent. So now him, his wife, and two little baby girls are living in a tent. The land of Al-Aqsa, one of the important masajid of Islam, and the first qibla of the Muslims, historically has been governed by Muslims for almost 1400 years, apart from these two blips, the Crusaders and now the Zionists. However, he was 12 years old, so he remembers the whole Nakba vividly. He remembers everything about it in terms of how these Jewish terrorist groups emerged, how they attacked the villages and towns, how they forced them out of their homes through this ethnic cleansing. But the Iraqi authorities did not give him permission, and they cut his supply lines. And Palestinian women used to sing a song about this betrayal. It would go, Shlono Salih Zaki, Maku Amar, what's wrong with you, Salih Zaki? Why did you not give the order to fight? And Salih Zaki was the minister responsible for that decision. When he said, do not forsake Palestine, he said that this is the jewel in the crown of the Ummah, and the
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah al-Kareem wa ala alihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of Seek in Mind podcast, where we try to look at current realities and delve deeply into them from an Islamic perspective. And my co-host today with me is Abu Yusuf Al-Hanbali, and our special guest for today is Brother Amar Hussein, dealing with it on the topic of Gaza and what's going on. Currently, we know what's going on. Assalamu alaikum, brother. Thank you for coming down to our podcast. So maybe you want to just introduce yourself for our viewers.
Yeah, so my name is Amar Hussein. I'm a Palestinian by background. My father is a Nakba survivor. So over the last 2 years in particular, I've been telling that story and the story of the people of Gaza in podcasts and talks at universities and masajid up and down the country. And yeah, essentially I'm here to, inshallah, hopefully shed more light onto this important topic.
Now I'm looking forward to hearing some of your own personal stories. I actually haven't heard them. So let's go straight into the topic. We know what's going on right now in Gaza. Can you describe what's going on? We've heard about the atrocities, but can you tell us in more description what's going on right now there?
Yeah, so I think every time I start to talk about Palestine, I always want to remember and centre the people of Gaza, because I think the suffering that they're going through is really off the spectrum in terms of the calamity that's befallen them. Every day is just another day of massacres and slaughter, really. So just on my way here today, there was a massacre near a bakery in Gaza. 11 people were murdered, many of them children. I saw another video of a father saying, sending off his children who'd been murdered, 3 of them. And the picture is just one of pure grief. Every day that scene is repeated, and it's almost been 700 days. We know about the journalists who've been murdered. So just in the last few days, we had the Nasser hospital that was hit, and intentionally to what they call a double tap strike, where they strike it once and then they hope in the response, where the rescuers come in, where the journalists come in, they actually struck it again, murdering several journalists, many medical staff. Over 20 people were murdered. We know about Anas al-Sharif, Allah yarhamuh, who was murdered in the last few weeks. So it's just a scene of repeated carnage, and the world just watches it. So everything I say, everything I talk about, the reason I send to the people of Gaza is that they are unique. They're unique in what they're suffering in terms of the genocide. They are the ones who are standing tall and resilient despite what's happened. So I do put them on a different platform, that they are the crown of this ummah, in my opinion, not the Palestinians in general, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I'm really, my family on the West Bank, but you have to acknowledge the steadfastness, the resilience, the link to Islam, the Quran that the people of Gaza have shown, and to stand with them, because they are standing for this whole ummah. I just want one comment that Anas al-Sharif mentioned, Allah yarhamuh, when he said, do not forsake Palestine. He said that this is the jewel in the crown of the ummah, and the heartbeat of every free person. I mean, I'm just paraphrasing his words, but those are, in essence, his words. This responsibility of Palestine belongs to this whole Ummah, but yet I think it has been abandoned, unfortunately, and that's what I want to talk about.
And we know the missiles have been strikes have been continuously happening, but outside of that, the Palestinians also face the issue of famine and food, lack of food, water, sanitation. Can you tell us a bit about?
Look, I mean, the situation in Gaza is almost indescribable. So the only other place currently in the world that has a similar level of starvation or famine is Al-Fashir in Darfur in Sudan, where it's comparable, at least comparable, if not worse actually there, because what they've done is they besieged the city in Darfur, 750,000 people, since May 2024. Gaza has been besieged as well for the last 22 months. Sometimes there are food aid coming in, and other times that will be stopped. And whatever's coming in is only a tiny percentage of what's required. So in terms of famine, it's widespread. Many people have died of malnutrition and starvation. We have a situation where they're rationing food. Many of these like soup kitchens are running out of food. People have lost a huge amount of weight. So yeah, it's a multi-pronged attack on the people of Gaza. Sanitation, lack of housing, because they've destroyed almost everything. There's hardly a school left standing. Every hospital has pretty much been attacked. So it's a complete annihilation of the people of Gaza. I spoke to a brother yesterday who reached out to me seeking some financial support. And I have a tendency to want to call to ensure that it's a legitimate request, because unfortunately, even in this day and age, people are still trying to make a quick buck by pretending to be from Gaza. And I spoke to him. He just had a baby girl. His wife had a baby girl 10 days ago, and he showed me the baby girl in a tent. So now him, his wife, and 2 little baby girls are living in a tent. And that's the reality of so many people in Gaza. So yeah, it's a picture that is almost hard to describe. As one person put it on a post I saw recently, you either follow the videos in Gaza or you don't. Because if you follow them, your whole life has changed. If you don't follow them, you're living your life as if nothing's happening.
It's really heartbreaking.
You mentioned, you said about Anas al-Sharif, rahimullah, he said that Palestine is the jewel of the Sunnah. What is so important about Palestine to the Muslims? Can you give us some background on that?
Yeah, so Palestine, obviously, the land of Al-Aqsa. One of the important masajid of Islam, and, the first Qibla of the Muslims, historically has been governed by Muslims for almost 1400 years, apart from these 2 blips, the Crusaders and now the Zionists. So it has a huge importance to Muslims. And when we see that people actually in Gaza, they're talking about Al-Aqsa and they're talking about Al-Quds, and they've never been there. I think 99% of people from Gaza haven't left Gaza. It's because of the siege on Gaza, even before the genocide, it's very hard to leave Gaza and it's very hard to come into Gaza. But yet they're talking about Al-Aqsa. They're talking about Al-Quds. So the link to them and Islam is very clear. I mean, the amount of huffaz of Quran, the reciters of Quran, the people who know the Quran by heart, is huge. They would have read the verses about the Isra wal Maraj to Masjid Al-Aqsa. So they have a very, very strong link to it. So yes, it's very much part and parcel of the Islamic Aqidah.
You're saying that your father, he was a Nakba survivor. So can you give us some background on that?
Yeah, so my father now is nearly 90, mashallah. And he was one of those people who was old enough to remember the Nakba. So don't forget, many people may have been through the Nakba, but they're probably they're now maybe in their late 70s, early 80s, but they would have been very young children at the time, because the Nakba happened about 77, 78 years ago. However, he was 12 years old. So he remembers the whole Nakba vividly. He remembers everything about it in terms of how these Jewish terrorist groups emerged, how they attacked the villages and towns, how they forced them out of their homes through this ethnic cleansing. So he came from a small village called Qanir. Qanir is near Haifa. Haifa is the second main city of occupied Palestine. So he was part of a large family. My grandfather had, I think, 12 children at that time. And they were prosperous. They lived off, these farming lands, very comfortable life in that respect. He remembers riding his horse with his brother on their farming lands. He remembers taking their horses and washing them on the coasts in Palestine before they used to sell them. So it was a life that was, I mean, even though it was under occupation, British occupation, they still had ownership of their own lands. So he, along with all his family, were forced out in 1948, and they became refugees internally within Palestine in the West Bank, initially in the city of Jenin. And it's a really interesting story, actually, why they ended up in Jenin. But it's a story that not many people know about. So what happened in 1948 is the Arab armies, under the command of the British, really, because it was General Glubb of the British forces. He was actually the officer that led the defense of Palestine, supposedly. But he was British and he was under the Jordanian army. So it was a really strange situation that you have a British general, even though they're the ones who promised this land of Palestine as a Jewish homeland, defending Palestine. But this was all part of a illusion, a myth, really, that they were trying to defend Palestine. But during that time, there were some officers who were sincere. And one such officer was Omar Ali Bayraktar. He was actually an Iraqi officer. So in 1948 in Jenin, he managed to defeat the Haganah forces there. So he completely decimated them. They say that they lost 300 of their terrorist forces there. And the Iraqi army, there was 44 shuhada. And that number 44 is very specific because they're all buried in Jenin, in the Maqbarat al-Shuhada, the graveyard of the martyrs of Jenin. So my father ended up there with his family in Jenin under the protection of the Iraqi army. So they lived there for several years in the tents of Jenin, and they basically were protected by them. They were given food by them. They were given medicines by them. He remembers many stories of going to the Iraqi army, and they would give medicines to the little children, and they would give them food. So subhanAllah, that was a really important event in the history of this occupation, because what it showed actually is that this occupation wasn't very strong, but there was a lot of collusion between the political leadership in the Arab lands, the Arab regimes, the British, and the Jewish state. So just to give you an example of Omar Ali Bayraktar, his thinking, he actually, after defeating the forces there, wanted to liberate Haifa. So Palestine, by the way, is extremely small, and people need to understand the geography of Palestine. So the whole width of Palestine is barely the distance between London and Leicester. So just put that into perspective. It's a very, very small piece of land. So to go from one edge to another, width-wise, you're really travelling no more than a couple of hours. So in Jenin, which is the edge of the West Bank, to Haifa is actually a relatively short journey. And Haifa is a very important city. So it's a coastal city, it's very large. And he wanted to liberate it. So he asked permission to move on and liberate Haifa. But the Iraqi authorities did not give him permission, and they cut his supply lines. And Palestinian women used to sing a song about this betrayal. It would go, Shlono Salih Zaki, Maku Amr, what's wrong with you, Salih Zaki? Why did you not give the order to fight? And Salih Zaki was the minister responsible for that decision. So you can imagine the thinking of this general who said, hang on, these are very, very weak terrorist forces, we can finish them. But they prevented them from doing so. And the same happened with the Jordanian army. They made many back deals, behind the scenes with the Israelis, or there wasn't even a state then, but with the Jewish forces there, the Haganah, the Ergan, the Lehi, and they basically ended up selling Palestine. So just to give you that background, it's really important to understand Palestine was betrayed from over 75 years ago.
You mentioned about the British, because they had a role occupied under the British for quite a long period. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit more about the Balfour Declaration?
So the Balfour Declaration happened on the 2nd of November 1917. The more important event that people don't realise is the battles of Gaza, which led to the Balfour Declaration. So almost like our history starts at the Balfour Declaration. But how did the Balfour Declaration happen? And this is the part that's missing in the history of most Muslims and people who follow the Palestinian issue. So what happened actually started really in 1917, and you can go back even further in terms of the Zionist movement, the immigration of Jews from Europe and from even other lands. But really the most important shift in power happened in 1917 with the occupation of Palestine by the British forces. So they attempted to take Gaza Funnily enough, it was Gaza. Gaza is always at the heart of everything in Palestine in that respect. They tried to take Gaza in March of 1917. So Britain came from Egypt and attempted to take Gaza. And the army defending it were the Ottomans. So, even though the Ottomans are like historic ancient figures, we think of them as wearing turbans and sultans sitting in the palaces of Istanbul. They were the Ottomans defending Gaza in 1917. Totally routed the British forces in 1917. I mean, it was a total defeat of in March. So they came back in April and tried to take Gaza again. Again, completely decimated the forces that tried to occupy Gaza. The British are very, very clever though. They realized, hang on, the Ottomans are not going to be defeated easily. Even though they used to laugh about the Ottomans, the sick man of Europe, it used to be called. But yet they were still powerful enough to completely defeat the invading troops. So what they did was what they do everywhere, and that is divide and conquer, divide and rule. So they set about working with the Arab nationalists, Sharif Hussein, Sharif of Mecca as they call him. He basically colluded with the British to work to undermine the Ottoman state. So just before the genocide, I was in Jordan in August 2023, and I visited the two locations that were crucial to the defeat of the Ottomans, and it wasn't in Palestine, it was in Jordan. So one was Aqaba. Aqaba is a port city, and the Ottomans used to use it for refueling and resupplying their forces in Palestine. But don't forget, it was all one country at that time. So they used to send supplies from Aqaba through to Palestine. And also another place right in the north of the country called Yarmouk. And Yarmouk is where the Ottoman railway runs. So the Hijaz railway that Sultan Abdul Hamid II built, or he oversaw that. And there's you can actually see it from, it's a very small track of railway. You can see where they bombed it in Yarmouk. And I remember taking a picture of that exact place. It's still there. The railway that goes from Syria through to Jordan, where they bombed it. And they bombed the railway across Jordan. The Hijaz railway runs across Jordan and it goes all the way to Medina. Completely destroyed the supply lines. So from roughly April all the way through to about October, they were working on weakening the Ottoman defences of Palestine, but it was through the Arab revolt. So these Arabs who believed in this Arab Khilafah and a great Arab state worked with the British to undermine the rule of the Ottomans. And then they came back in November or late October, and Britain essentially walked into Gaza. It wasn't a fight. It only took them about a day, and they took Gaza over, because at that point the Ottomans were so weak from all of these internal problems and the lack of supply lines that they walked into Gaza. They in fact actually took a place called Be'er Seba just before Gaza on end of October, and then they walked into Gaza on the 1st of November, and on the 2nd of November the Balfour Declaration happened. But yet we start at the Balfour Declaration, but there was a series of treachery that happened which led to the Balfour Declaration. Just to give you an idea of how much the Ottomans worked to defend Gaza, they built a station in Be'er Seba. Be'er Seba is just outside of Gaza, and that was used to send supplies to strengthen the defences of the Ottomans. The Ottomans had so many problems at that point, but they're still trying to defend Palestine. This is at the weakest stage of the Ottoman history, really. It's almost at the point of collapse. But yet they were able to defeat 2 attempts to take Gaza. But yet, after all of that internal strife and division, they were finally overwhelmed.
Just before the 1917 Balfour Declaration, wasn't there in the 1915-16 the Sykes-Picot Treaty?
Yeah, so Sykes-Picot was essentially the downfall of the whole region, really, because what they did, and there's a talk I give and I show people the maps of Palestine and that region prior to the Sykes-Picot Agreement and then after the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And what you see is essentially they were administrative areas previously. So to give you a really interesting example, my dad comes from a place called Haifa. They were part of the Vilayet of Beirut, not Palestine, Beirut. So could you imagine, it was all intermixed. It was like you could be part of Vilayet of Beirut, but you're actually in what they call now modern day Palestine. Al-Urdun was part of northern Palestine and northern Jordan, which is Jordan. Damascus, the region of Damascus, was actually all the way through to Jordan. in the administrative regions of the Ottomans. What they came and said, oh no, we're going to give you different countries. You're going to have Palestine, you're going to have Jordan, you're going to have Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, and they carved it all up. And one crazy story, which I always tell just to show you how stupid this issue of nationalism is. In the first draft in 1916, this is even before they tried to occupy the lands, the British and the French agreed how they were going to divide up the lands. The first draft had Mosul, which is in current-day Iraq, in Syria. So they were going to give Mosul to the Syrians. The French were going to have it. But in the last draft in 1917, it went to Iraq because the British realized it was rich in oil. So they said, no, you're not going to get it, French. We're going to have this. This is going to be our piece of land. So a brother gave an amazing example. He said, imagine the first draft was agreed. If the first draft was agreed, the people of Mosul would be raising the Syrian flag, singing the Syrian anthem, saying, I am a Suri. But because the second draft was agreed, they've just done exactly the same, but they said, Ana Iraqi, supporting the Iraqi team and waving the Iraqi flag. That is how ridiculous this carving up of the lands was. So yes, the Sykes-Picot was a crucial part of this, but at first they needed to occupy. So they occupied through Gaza, and they took over the rest of Palestine, they took Jordan, Syria, all the rest of it, all collapsed.
Now, I know the British, and I think originally, before America got involved, they had this view of a binational state, and they did offer, I think in 1947, I think for the UN, for the Arabs to accept, I think the resolution on it, partition plan.
Yeah.
What was the deal about?
The partition plan is as ridiculous as the two-state solution that's being discussed today. To be honest, that's even dead in the water. No one's even talking about the two-state solution anyway because the Zionists don't believe in it. But let's just go back to the partition plan. In 1947, they said, okay, we need to partition Palestine into a Jewish homeland and an Arab homeland. But the plan, and this is where it just shows you how the injustice of these people works. First of all, they had no right to take any person's land, whether they are, and this is a really important point because some people get really bogged down in discussion about Palestine was Palestine and all this business. You're a rightful owner of your land. Who has the right to come and take you off that land? And that was Muslims, that was Christians, and there was even a few who were Jewish before the mass migration. That was their land. They had the right to those homes, to those farmlands. They had the deeds. It was their land. So this idea that someone can come and kick you off your land is the ultimate injustice of oppression. But what they tried to do in the partition plan is they said, look, we're going to give roughly 2/3 as a Jewish homeland. And at that time, the Jewish population made up, I think, about 1/3 of the population. And 2/3 of the Arab population were going to get 1/3 of the land. It's just as ridiculous as the two-state solution now, where they're giving you the crumbs and they're saying, oh, we did give you something. Why are you arguing? Why are you complaining? So it was obviously something that was never going to be accepted. It was on the basis of theft and murder, and the people rejected it naturally. So the British also tried to push this concept of this one state where everyone could live together and they would all have representation. But ultimately, the mass migration of the Jewish population was intentional, and they also armed them and allowed them to infiltrate the police force. And there's a British historian that explains this, and he said that the British involvement in the creation of Israel was very clear. They tacitly approved for them to be given a position within the police force and in any of the armed positions, and they used that to then overwhelm the Palestinian population, which was being arrested and chased and forced to disarm. So my grandfather himself was arrested twice by the British. He was in British prisons in Palestine twice, my grandfather. That's the reality. People try to resist. But what could they do when, on one hand, you're arming these Jewish settlers and giving them a position in these state institutions, and then you're saying, oh, we're being fair, we're being bystanders. You're not bystanders. But what did happen actually at one point is some of these groups weren't happy with the British, how slow they were in giving them power over the state of Palestine. So they actually attacked British forces as well. So the King David Hotel, they killed the Sergeants' Affair when they kidnapped 2 British sergeants. They killed them and then they hanged them up. And then another British sergeant tried to get them, but they booby-trapped his body. There's so many stories of them killing British soldiers. and attacking British interests in Palestine because they said you're being too slow. So groups like the Lehi and the Stern Gang, they were a bit more militant than even the Haganah, and they would attack the British interests in the region because they wanted to force them out so that they could take the whole of Palestine. So it's a really a history of pure, evil in terms of what they did. Many civilians were killed in some of these attacks. So they had a policy that they just wanted to force out the Palestinian population from their lands, and they did this through shock and awe. So they would go into towns and villages and murder everyone. But then what they would hope is that people would hear those stories and then leave. And in reality, that's what happened, because they were not very well armed and they didn't have any matching capability compared to the Haganah and these other forces. So just to give you an example of my own village, Kannir, and my father's village, they actually tried to defend themselves. So they asked the eldest son of each family, to be armed and to protect Kannir against these forces. So my uncle Hassan was part of that resistance. So my dad remembers the day that these Jewish terrorist groups tried to come and take over Kannir. So he remembers in the night the shooting. He goes, as soon as that first shot was fired, until the morning, we were just up, these kids in their bedrooms, just listening to all this shooting. And in the morning, they managed to repel them, by the way, that day. And in the morning, they saw all the blood of these terrorists that were killed trying to take the city, trying to take the town. So they managed to defend it. But what happened is, as it progressed, the Nakba, they realized there was no way they were going to be able to defend themselves against what was becoming clearly uneven odds. So my grandfather took the difficult decision of saying, I have to get my family out of here, and they made their way to Jenin.
So why was it so difficult? If you look back at what was taking place at that time, we got new states coming up, they colonized our lands, they colonized the Muslim lands, a lot of them became independent. Why was it so difficult to make a Palestinian or Israeli binational state when all the other lands like Turkey and Egypt, they were already independent? Why couldn't they do that?
So you have to understand the history of Zionism. Zionism doesn't want any kind of fair agreement or a situation where they are part of a government of Arabs, Muslims, Christians. They want a Jewish homeland, and that means they want the population to be primarily Jewish. So one of the reasons for the Nakba is to force out the Arab population so that they would be the majority, number one. Number two, they don't want to stop at Palestine. I mean, Netanyahu just said a week ago, my spiritual goal is to have a greater Israel. And that goes all the way from Egypt through to like Iraq, Saudi. If you look at the full map of the greater Israel. So they have no intention of having a state that's equal for all people. In fact, you have a situation where there was all people, Muslim, Christian and Jew and other faiths, and that was under Islam. So Islam never dictated that we have to have this many Muslims, this many Jews, this many Christians, this many Druze, whatever it might be. There was all of these people. And in fact, a lot of people don't realize that actually at the time of the Ottomans, there was something like 14%, I believe, of Palestine was Christian. That's a large percentage. Now it's a tiny percentage. So the Christian population is diminished to almost non-existent in Palestine when it was over 14% at the time of the Ottomans. So it wasn't about religion, it was about your rights being protected as a citizen. But what these Zionists wanted to do was create a Jewish homeland. And that means on the graves and the lands of the indigenous Palestinian population. So there was never intention to have any kind of fairness or representation from the people.
So after the draft for Israel and Palestine was rejected, what was the next significant event after that?
So the Palestinians rejected it, and therefore these Jewish terrorist forces, the Haganah, Stern Gang, Lehi, they then decided that they wanted to take the land by force, and they declared their state. What happened is that the Arabs came in to say that they're defending Palestine now, the Arab armies. But as I said, you have to remember the dimensions here. The Arab armies are ex-British colonies. The Jordanian army, almost every senior position was a British officer. Like Glubb leading it, he was the most senior officer. And then underneath them were other British officers, and then maybe some of the junior officers were Jordanian. One such officer was Mashhur Hadith al-Jazi. and I'll talk about him later if you want. He's a really interesting officer, because in the 1968 Battle of Karama, he defeated the invading Israeli forces. So what happened? All of these armies came in to Palestine and said, we're defending the people there. But what they took was the West Bank and Gaza. In fact, they took even more land, but they settled and they made agreements with this newly formed Zionist entity that they would give up some of their land for a settlement. So the Jordanians kept the West Bank and the Egyptians kept Gaza, and they gave up pretty much all the land in between. So this is what they call proper Israel now, if you want to call it that. This is the land that's not going to be part of a two-state solution. This will be the land that stays under Israeli authority. So this was the plan. That was essentially the plan. The plan was that they were going to come in and defend the people, but in fact they just made deals. They cut deals behind closed doors. So the Jordanians wanted the West Bank, the Egyptians took Gaza, and the rest was sold. And it was the first stage of betrayal, because that betrayal just continued following that event. We know in 1967 they lost all the land. So they lost the West Bank, they lost Gaza, they lost the Golan Heights. So the Sinai was lost in Egypt. So pretty much not only did they lose Palestine, they lost so much surrounding land as well. And this has been the course that's continued until then, really. Since then, sorry. It has never been about protecting the land of Palestine. It was always about their own regimes and keeping their positions of power.
So it started as if you look at it, it started as a European project in that area. Now, where did US, America get involved? Why did they get involved?
So, yeah, it's a European project initially. Bear in mind at that time the European powers were the dominant powers in the world. So Britain and France were probably the two dominant European powers in terms of their empires across Asia and Africa, etc. Britain had a huge foothold in the Arab region, and so did France. So they were the ones who were heavily involved. But as we know, Britain and France lost their power, especially after World War II, and the Americans came to bail out Europe against firstly the Nazis, but also then against the Soviets, because they were encroaching on Europe. At that point, America became the dominant power in the world, and naturally the sphere of influence shifted to them, and they continued the same policy. Ultimately, for them to have an outpost in the region is very important, because they align in terms of their foreign interests. What you do have now in America is potentially some internal conflict going on, as many people have seen, both within some of the political class, some of the media, where they're starting to challenge whether their policies or their interests should align. So is it really an America first policy, or is it an Israel first policy? And there is now an internal conflict going on. But ultimately, America, until very recently, was on the same page. Their view was Israel aligns with American interests in the region, and therefore we should support it through financial aid, military aid, etc. And that's always been the policy until now. It's still the policy officially, but what you're finding now is some internal commotion between some of the political thinkers, the journalists, the media, especially on the social media platforms. So like your Tucker Carlson's, for example, openly interviewing people who are anti kind of Israel being put first. Why is the Israeli flag deemed not to be burned? I don't know if you know this, but it was recently passed a law that you can't burn the Israeli flag in America, but you can burn the American flag. You can't burn the Israeli flag because it's deemed to be anti-Semitic, but you can burn the American flag. You can boycott American companies, but you can't boycott Israeli companies in many states. In fact, you could be penalized in terms of not receiving aid from the federal government. These are really strange decisions. So Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's like a big politician in the U.S. She's been openly condemning these actions, and she's part of the Trump movement. So I think what we're seeing now is some rift internally, but ultimately it's always been a Western policy to support Israel, and that's very clear from all Western capitals.
So who's leading who? The Zionist or?
I think honestly we're seeing a real rift between the two now. I think it wasn't, the days of maybe Kennedy and Carter. They still believed that they had to control this client state. But now, who has huge control in terms of the politicians that get elected. AIPAC has a huge amount of control. Just to give you an example, there was one, and I can't remember where this happened, but there was a candidate in 2024 who was showing anti-Israel remarks or sentiments. They funded another guy to the tune of something like $500 million to make sure he gets in, and he got in. So they will work day and night to make sure they have politicians, congressmen, senators who are pro-Israel. You'll see in this Code Pink women who go around Congress and the Senate, and they always show how the Israeli flags are being put up outside people's offices. So they get a huge amount of funding, many of these politicians. The establishment media has a huge amount of Jewish Zionist influence. I mean, it's ridiculous, both in America and across the Western world as well. So all the centers of power, that soft power is actually being heavily influenced by the pro-Israel lobby. So I think we are seeing a real change. 50% of the population now openly don't side with Israel in the US. That's never been the case. It's always been a firm US support base. And if you look at the younger population, it's even greater. It's like ridiculously 70, 80+% are anti-Israel now. So I think social media has been the big change. And that's why now they're trying to govern social media, because they realized they lost the mainstream media, establishment media narrative. So they quickly moved to control the social media narrative. So just give you two recent examples. The head of hate speech on TikTok was a former IDF soldier. She's a woman. And the head of Instagram's CEO of Instagram has family living in Israel. So that's the kind of control that they've got now, even on social media platforms. So I think this is developing. But let's not forget, capitalism looks beyond just Palestine as one of its objectives. It's always looking to further its business interests. But what you see, and the best way to describe it, it's almost like a marriage made in hell. It's between the Jewish Zionists and the capitalist elites, and they're both working hand in hand because they both have no interest for the Muslim world. They just want to ensure that they dominate world trade, world power, and that's what they're doing.
Just on the topic of America, so where do you think the future for Zionism, America's support in Zionism, is? Like you said, the statistics is going against Israel.
I think it's very interesting. I think it is really changing. What you have different levels of awakening, and that's the way I can describe it. So I'll give you an example. A lot of people would have seen Tony Aguilar talking recently. He was on the Tucker Carlson show. He was that American soldier who was out in the GHF sites, the so-called aid sites in Gaza that were murdering people and still murdering them today. I think 10 people were murdered today. So he did a massive whistleblow on the whole thing. He just said, this is all like basically crimes against humanity. People are being shot and killed intentionally, including children. But he still talks about, I respect Israel. I believe we should support Israel. So that's his level of awakening. This doesn't seem right. We shouldn't be supporting these crimes, but I still support the concept. And then you have another level of awakening, which is, why are we supporting a colonizing state? Why are we supporting an illegal settler state? And that's happening at one level in America as well. So one interesting person that I interviewed out in Jordan was Josephine Gilbao. But she's a former American intelligence officer, and she's turned on the whole system because she no longer sees it as just Israel. She says, what about our role in Iraq? What about our role in Afghanistan, in Guantanamo Bay? What are the capitalist elites doing? And that's what's happening. So I think what's more interesting is not just the awakening of Zionism, it's who backs Zionism and what has the American empire done in the world all these years. So I think the awakening needs to be at that level. It's not just Palestine, because they have their hands bloody in Iraq. They have their hands bloody in Afghanistan. They have their hands bloody in so many coups and, illegal, well, not illegal, they're officially legal, these regimes that essentially do their bidding. So I think that awakening is the one that's more interesting. It's seeing that Zionism has actually had the backing of the US empire, which has brought so much suffering to the world.
So the Americans that back the Zionism, how does it benefit their interests?
So there's different levels of it. Again, everything is a bit more complicated than what seen at face value. So you have some who genuinely believe in this crazy Christian Zionist ideology, which is that they want all the Jews to go back to Palestine, because by doing so it will bring the return of the Messiah. They genuinely believe this stuff. So that's one level. And that's part of the propaganda that used. Ted Cruz mentioned it recently on an interview with Tucker Carlson. He was totally embarrassed, but he was showing up really for what he was saying. He says, the Bible says we support Israel. In fact, it was misquoting even their own text. Really, it was about supporting the genuine Jewish people, not this illegal foreign new state of Israel. But anyway, I don't want to get into the details, but so you have that level, and then you have another level who see that there's an alignment. The alignment is that if we are in the Muslim world, we keep the Muslim world preoccupied, we keep them weak. So when Netanyahu tried to push for the Iraq war, a lot of people agreed with that because these hawkish people believe in controlling the Middle East. So if you weaken Iraq, if you weaken Syria, if you weaken Sudan, if you weaken Libya, if you weaken all these countries, what's left? What have we got left, really? Which countries are still not consumed in war in our lands? Hardly any. Afghanistan and the fallout that had on Pakistan. You could argue that there's hardly any country that hasn't had significant fallout because of American policies in the region. So I think it aligns with the Zionist interest in many cases. But some people are waking up to the fact, shouldn't we be more interested in our own future as American people? We don't have free healthcare, but we support a country that does have free healthcare. We can't look after our homeless, but we're happy to send bombs day and night to people to go and kill other people's children. So that awakening has happened amongst the youth more. But I think what we're still not at the point of actually saying, it's not just that we don't believe in Israel's policies, we don't believe in the project altogether. That's what you want people to get to. Because when they realize that, they realize their support for colonialism and all the injustice that is brought over the last 80 years.
It was America that came with the idea, in my reading, the idea of two-state solution.
That's right.
And I don't know how serious they are right now, but it seems that's quite a strong sentiment even amongst Palestinians. They think that is the only way that they can get, some say, have a Palestinian state.
So it's a split view. So I'd say the majority don't. So if you look at the stats, I've seen them recently, it's still majority don't believe in the two-state solution. But again, to speak about Palestinians, they're not one whole. They have their own opinions. So you have the people of Gaza, who I said to you stand different from the rest. Then you have the Palestinians who live within the land of Israel, i.e. they hold Israeli passports. And then you have the Palestinians of the West Bank, and you have the Palestinians in diaspora as well. So there's different Palestinians. First of all, we need to shift the discussion about Palestinians to the responsibility to this land, and that goes beyond Palestine. So the fact that Anas Sharif, Allah yarhamu, reminded us that this is the jewel in the crown of the Muslim world, what is he saying? He's saying it's your responsibility. Because it's not for you to abandon it and say, oh, well, the Palestinians can decide if they want a two-state solution. The Palestinians can decide what they sacrifice. So that's number one. But more importantly, I think now, if you look at this two-state solution, it's dead in the water. It's finished. No one's really talking about it as a credible solution. So you have people like Mahmoud Abbas, head of the PA, Palestinian Authority, who basically will do anything that the Israelis tell him to do. Absolutely anything. So he's killed so many Palestinians in the West Bank. And these are the Palestinian security forces killing their own people. That's happening routinely now. Then you have the Gaza, who's been out of that authority for about 20 years. So they have a very different view. Even when you hear people talking about two-state solution, a lot of them are talking about it back in the day of the Oslo Accords. But reality now, the settlements are completely dominating the West Bank. There was almost not a single area in the West Bank where you wouldn't encounter a settlement. So I've been there not long ago. And as you drive through the West Bank, you just see settlements everywhere. And they're all usually in high places. And some of them are huge. Some of these settlements are like, they have universities in them. They're like massive. They're not like some kind of settlement of like 200 people. They're settlements that literally dominate the landscape. So near Nablus is one of the big cities in the West Bank, you'll see settlements on all the surrounding hills and mountains. So they overlook the whole region. So I think the two-state solution was an American policy previously. It seems that American statements now are almost giving permission for this Jewish state to say that we don't believe in it. So they keep saying we want the Jewish homeland in Gaza, we want a Jewish homeland in the West Bank, and they don't even talk about a two-state solution. So even your enemy is saying they don't want a two-state solution, but some of our sellouts are saying we want a two-state solution. They're saying, no, we don't want a two-state solution. We want Greater Israel. We want, after we finish with the West Bank and Gaza Strip, we're going to come for Egypt, we're going to come for Jordan, we're going to come for Saudi, we're going to come for Iraq. That's their plan. And we can say, oh, no, they can't be serious. But look what they started with and look what they've got now. Really? do they look like they're not serious? I mean, they're saying it with their own mouths, they're acting upon it, but yet we're saying, let's hold on to this figment of our imagination of a two-state solution. So yeah, I think it's an American policy, a stated American policy, but in reality, on the ground, you can see that they're not moving towards any two-state solution.
I want to touch upon this experience. Your father, he went through the Nakba.
Yeah.
What has his view regarding what happened now? The similarities between what happened in 1948 to what has happened in the displacement of Palestinians in Gaza today?
So I think everyone accepts that the Nakba of 48 does not compare to the Nakba of today. It's way, way worse now. I mean, just on metrics alone, it's worse. So, people estimate between 15, 20, 25,000 people killed, maybe 750 to 1.5 million displaced. In Gaza, the most conservative, that's the bare minimum, 60,000 people killed. But actually, some estimates go into the hundreds of thousands, and it could be completely true. So many people missing under the rubble. The injuries, amputations, destruction of healthcare, destruction of education, destruction of homes, destruction of agricultural land, destruction of water systems, absolute annihilation. So it's not even comparable. We can't even compare the Nakba of 1948 to today. The difference now, I guess, is there has been an awakening. It hasn't resulted in the support of those who need to support the Palestinian people and the people of Gaza, but there has been an awakening. So where maybe 2 years ago you would have been having discussions with people, even in the West, what was Palestine's history, what is Zionism, what is the Jewish homeland, all of this would have been like new language and new discussions. Now you have people saying, people know everything about the Nakba in 1948, the whole narrative of 7th of October has been shifted and changed from that initial mainstream media account, the Israeli account. So I think there has been an awakening, but what needs to happen now is not an awakening, it's actually change, because what's happening in Palestine is due to the weakness of the Muslim position. We are not united, we have no political leadership, and what you see is the ability for this enemy to rain terror upon the people with no response. I mean, people would have seen the empty statement by Erdogan yesterday saying that they're going to cut all ties with Israel. But this liar said he cut all trade in May 2024. But yet, in November 2024, the Turkish citizens exposed him by going to the ports and showing that Israeli ships were still sailing out of the ports to Haifa. And they showed exactly what these ships were. And it showed that they were destined to Haifa. So in reality, there hasn't been a strong position by any of the neighboring countries, particularly the neighboring countries in terms of Jordan, Egypt, Turkey, you could say, in that locality. The position of Saudi Arabia and the MBS. The position of UAE is even worse because they pretty much are allies with the Zionists. In fact, there was a report that they sent weapons in a shipment, in a transport plane about a week ago. We know that Egypt allowed a Israeli warship, the SAR 5, to sail through the Suez Canal in November 2024. And in the same month, they allowed a shipment, the Catherine MV, to sail from MV Catherine, I can't remember which way around it is, from Alexandria to Haifa, full with armaments for the IDF. So look, the treachery is off the scale. The discussion that we need to have is Palestine a problem of the Palestinian people, or is it a problem of the Ummah? As soon as you change your view to that, then your response changes. And this is the key that we're not discussing. This is the key issue that we're not discussing. So I'll give you an example. I gave a talk at university, and one brother from an Egyptian background said to me, how can the Egyptians help? Because if the Egyptians help, then they'll attack Egypt. And he goes, it's not just Israel will attack Egypt, the US will attack Egypt. They've got the Qatar base, the biggest base in the Middle East. They will strike Egypt. So I said to him, okay, it's a good question actually. So I'm going to ask you a question, and based on your response, I'll answer your question. So I said, let's say Israel attacks the Sinai. Should Egypt respond? Silence. And then he said, yeah. Oh, I said, why? Because there's a line in the sand that says, this is Egypt and this is Palestine. So your Muslim brothers and sisters can be slaughtered on that side of the line in the sand that the foreigner gave you. But this line of the sand you have to protect with your blood and honor. You break that concept in the Muslim world, everything changes. Where we're at the moment is that the people are challenging that concept. So even in Egypt, people are saying we should support, we should send our army, we should stop trading. But the regime is doing exactly the opposite. It just signed a massive $35 billion gas deal with an Israeli company. Imagine in the midst of a genocide, you sign a $35 billion deal. So we need to challenge that narrative. We need to challenge the narrative of nationalism, which goes completely against the concept of unity in Islam, brotherhood in Islam. We need to challenge the concept of regimes that have become dependent on foreign aid and the IMF and World Bank. We need to challenge the narrative that as a Muslim Ummah we have no ability to respond and our armies are weak. If anything, if you look at the resistance, in 22 months they've continued to remain on their land, inflicting heavy casualties on this invading force, but yet our armies are silent. And they're the ones with the modern weaponry and drones and tanks and planes and radar and everything else, and they're not even in the game. So yeah, I think that's where we need to be taking the discussion. If we restricted to Palestine, we've fallen into the trap. We said, okay, hang on, this is a Palestinian issue. So the Palestinians have to find the solution for themselves. But this Palestine, the same Palestine was a land opened by Umar al-Khattab, radhiallahu anh. Was he a Palestinian? The same land opened by Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. Was he a Palestinian? A Kurd? This is the same land that was protected by an Iraqi general in 48. And the same land that was protected, or at least he fought the aggressor in 1968, Mashhur Hadith al-Jazi in Karama. And that was another famous victory. So all of these, this is part of our history. But yet we seem to now accept the narrative, Palestinians have to find a Palestinian solution.
That's quite a good point you made regarding that, how the different leaders came from the Kurds, from the Turks, like Abdul Hamid.
Yeah, of course.
Subhanallah. But now, if we, there is this reality that we can't do nothing. If you look, we've been here about 22 months and our rulers have completely betrayed us. It's so obvious, you cannot defend them. And without them, they're the ones who have the armies, and without them we can't really liberate Palestine. So how do we overcome this really sticky situation that we can't, at the same time we have our armies that is defending this?
So the situation is terrible. I don't want to paint a picture of optimism for the sake of optimism, because I know it's really difficult. So a brother was on someone did a webinar yesterday, and they had Dr. Ra'id Al-Sharif, the uncle of Anas al-Sharif, on there. It was a real privilege to be on the call with him. And he said something that I think we have to remind ourselves of. The situation is so bad that sometimes I wake up and I just feel like I don't even want to go to work. The images that I've seen more dead children in 22 months than is possible to see. How many dead children can you see? How many children can you see mutilated, completely amputated, dying of their wounds? I just saw an image of a child in a hospital that's probably going to die. His head is like there's some bleeding going on in his head that's clearly not survivable. But how much pain is that child going through now? And that is being repeated day in, day out. I have cried more about the images I've seen in Gaza than I've cried in my life. And this is like when my mother died when I was young. I can't even compare it. It was a fraction of what I've cried for Gaza. Because this is relentless. This is the first live stream genocide in history. And I keep mentioning live stream genocide because there are genocides just as bad. I don't want to make it out like the people of Gaza are suffering the worst thing in history, because we have committed, i.e. humanity has committed more atrocities against people than you can imagine. Whether it's in Congo, whether it's in Rohingya, the Muslims are in Burma, the Rohingya Muslims. It's a full-scale ethnic cleansing there. And they massacre people on a regular basis. Just recently, they massacred a whole village of people in Rakhine State in Burma, the Rohingya Muslims. Barely gets any coverage at all. And Sudan, we were saying that estimates of 150,000 murdered people, civilians in Sudan. In that one city, Al-Fashir, there's 750,000 people dying of famine. Over 1,000 children have been killed and maimed by the RSF, which are backed by the UAE, by the way. So could you imagine, atrocities everywhere. So look, Gaza is the biggest symptom of the failure that we're facing now. the failure of having any unified response, the failure of having a leadership that's sincere, the failure of not addressing nationalism. And I think we're panicking now. That's what we're doing. We're panicking. We're saying we have to find a solution. I see people saying to me, oh, it has to be the UN. We have to do something. We have to do anything we can. But where were we all these years? It's not as if the symptom of Gaza wasn't already there. It's just that we now have looked at this and said, how can we keep waking up to the same images of children and families being murdered every single day, being starved every single day? That's what we're saying. It's almost like we can't accept it as human beings. But Gaza was attacked in 2014. 1,500 civilians were killed then. We didn't do anything. In 2019, the Great March of Return, 33 children or around that number were sniped and killed by Israeli snipers. There was one Israeli sniper who boasted about shooting 42 kneecaps in one day. So this is a long line of symptoms of our failure in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the Rohingya Muslims, not to mention the non-Muslims who've suffered, whether it's Rwanda and other places where genocide has taken place. So our panic is because we weren't doing anything. The truth is, a lot of us have woken up now. We might have been semi-awake. I'd say we were semi-awake. We talked about these things, but we didn't give it the seriousness it needed. Now you can see this desperation that we have to stop this, because we are now witnessing the first live stream genocide in history. On my way down here, I was just driving in my local area, Rayners Lane, driving from my dad's house back to the station to come here, and I see a protest for Palestine. Like in the middle of a road that I wouldn't even imagine. It was outside the Conservative Party offices. And I stopped to just do a short video, and then I met a brother I know. I was like, what's happening? Every corner of the globe, people are demonstrating. In Sydney, in the Muslim world, in small little towns and villages across the UK. Old age pensioners are willing to get arrested because they believe so strongly about this. But our panic is because we weren't doing anything. And the reality is we should have been calling for military intervention not now, not 22 months ago, 77 years ago, and beyond. Because when Palestine fell, what did we think was going to happen? When our authority was handed over to a foreign government, what did we think was going to happen? We were going to get a nice rosy days in the future. When we didn't respond to Iraq, when the Muslim armies, Arab armies, joined the attack on Iraq. They joined the attack on Iraq. Egypt, Saudi, Kuwait. So our regimes are the problem. Our problem as people in those regimes is we've been too silent for too long.
If the regimes are the problem, what are you proposing? Replacing them with other regimes? Like we've seen Syria, the new government has come in. What do you propose as replacing these regimes, ensuring the same thing doesn't happen?
Yeah, so look, what's very clear now is our regimes and the people, those who control the power in our regimes are both the problem and the solution. And I think you mentioned the armed forces. They are the problem and the solution at the same time, because without them, you don't get the reins of power. But with them, they're currently fighting they're fighting their own people, or they're safeguarding the interests of these regimes. So an example that I always give, look at Morsi. Allah yarhamu. Morsi came to Egypt. He was elected by the people. There was an Islamic tendency there, Islamic call for a change of government. They wanted to move on from the times of Mubarak. He didn't have the army under his control. So what did they do? As soon as the time came, got rid of him. Just moved against him. Sisi moved against him. It was just the massacre in Cairo that just happened. The anniversary for it just happened a few days ago, by the way, where over 1,000, at least 1,000, some estimates say in the thousands, potentially 3,000 people were massacred in just 1 or 2 days. In 1 or 2 days, they sent helicopters to bomb their own people. I mean, you just think about that for a minute. Bombing your own people, killing your own people. They piled up their bodies in a masjid in Cairo. So why? Because the army was unfortunately in the hands of corrupt politicians, corrupt leaders. So the Ummah has to put the pressure where it needs to be. So look, that will take different forms. One thing that we have to do as Muslims is carry the Islamic call. When people are promoting nationalism, they're part of the problem. I would say you're complicit in genocide. Let's go that far. Anyone who promotes nationalism at this time is complicit in genocide. Because what you're saying is, I believe that we should maintain these authorities and regimes. What did the Prophet ﷺ say in the hadith? Change it with your hand, and if you can't, then speak out, and if you can't, then hate it in your heart. They're not even hating it in their heart. They're promoting the haram. They're promoting the nationalism. They're the ones who support Sisi. So some people still say, oh, we need to support him because he's our president. Then you're not even hating it in your heart. Just keep silent if you don't have the bravery to speak. No one said everyone's brave enough to speak. But surely you do not promote the institutions and the concepts that have put us in this mess in the first place. At least challenge them. So we have, alhamdulillah, some really good examples. That really creative young brother called Anas al-Habib from Holland, or he lives in Holland, but he's actually Egyptian originally. He did one action that set the whole world on fire when he locked the gates of the Egyptian embassy. That was so clever, because what he did, he turned it on them. He says, but it's locked from your side, they're not ours, mimicking them or using the example of what they say about the Rafah crossing. And that went viral. I mean, when I say viral, tens, hundreds of millions. And since then, they've been repeated in something like 60 incidents across the world. And the discussion now shifted from Palestine to the role of Egypt. And the same has happened in Jordan. In fact, there was a demonstration in Jordan about a month ago, maybe a bit longer. And the people in Jordan, they were saying something really powerful if you reflect on it. They were saying, we're sorry, people of Gaza, we are also under siege. We're under siege, because the siege may not be the same siege that we look at in Gaza, where they block the borders. But when your government sends the police and army to arrest you in the streets, when Jordanian citizens are tortured in the prisons and the dungeons, then who's your prisoner? Yeah, so who's imprisoning you? Your own government. Your own government is maintaining this line that we need to protect the state of Israel. They're saying we don't want to hear a word spoken about the occupation. We are the first line of defense for the occupation. And I was in Egypt for the March to Gaza. And I knew what was going to happen, because I know that the Egyptian regime is there to do what? To maintain the status quo, which is occupation of Palestine. So they were the people that stopped us. They were the people that tortured many of the people who came or beat them up. And the Samud convoy that was coming from North Africa, they're the ones who stopped it. So surely you have to put the blame where it needs to be, and that needs to be at the feet of the regimes. I'm not saying that you put the blame there as rhetoric. You just say, oh, the regime's to blame, and that's all you've got to say. I'm saying you engage with the people about this point, and we should not underestimate our ability. We're having this discussion in this podcast. Maybe a few hundred people watch this podcast, but those people watching it, there might be one person who can get this out to thousands, if not millions, and that's the reality. The reality is we all have a role to play. I can't tell you what your role is. Your role, you might be the best at visual effects and videos, or doing posts, or writing, or speaking, or giving khutbahs. I don't know what your role is. But if you're not in the game, if you're not in the field, then basically you're part of the problem.
There is a public opinion in the Ummah that to liberate Palestine, to defend Palestine, and it has to come from the army. And you mentioned that the army, you can't live without them. You need them. So how does the Ummah, what are the specific actions can the Ummah do in order to rally the army, get the army, awaken the army?
So I think it's unlikely that armies will move without regime change. Let's just start with that. But we are calling upon the armies to do their duty. By doing that, we're relying on those who have the ability in the army to take the right decisions to bring about that change. So we are not within the army ranks. We do not know how the army functions, which officer needs to speak to which officer in the right location to make the change. But we have the ability to influence them through our words. Now, there was no call for military intervention 22 months ago. None. Except from select few people. The odd person here and there. The odd khutbah there and there. The odd leaflet here and there. Now, I attended a seminar with 900 people last Saturday calling for military intervention. Muslim and non-Muslim, by the way. How did that happen? That happened because there was a call. That call became much more widespread, and people started adopting the idea. So what is the whole concept of putting pressure? Is that you make something dominant in society. That only becomes dominant if you start raising your voice behind it as well. You can't say, oh, it's a really nice call. I really like the idea of military intervention. It sounds good, but I'm not doing anything towards it. So what I would say that the steps that Muslims can take, especially Muslims because it's an obligation on them, is that they need to put pressure on those people that are within the armed forces or who can influence the armed forces. I'll give you my own personal example. I'm happy to mention it openly because I don't hide it, because I want people to know that you can have an influence. I use LinkedIn, which is a very strange platform to use for pro-Palestinian activism. But I've had people in the army commenting on my posts. So clearly people are seeing these posts. Clearly the army is being affected on social media. I'll give you one really interesting example. I commonly expose the regimes and expose the complicity in the genocide. And one day I mentioned Erdogan. And then I had lots of Turkish nationalists going for me, like really attacking me, saying, why don't you talk about the Arabs? Why don't you talk about the real traitors, the Arabs, and all of this business? So one brother commented on my post, and then I saw his profile, Special Forces, retired from the Special Forces, Turkish Special Forces. And he says, I agree with the brother, because I've seen him, he condemns and attacks the Arab regimes all the time. He's got a right to also condemn and account the regime of Erdogan. That's someone who was in the Turkish army. I had a Malaysian soldier once commenting on my post. I normally tag in the armies. In LinkedIn, you can tag in the organizations. So I say at Egyptian forces, at Jordanian armed forces, at Turkish, at Pakistani, and I listed all these countries. I didn't tag the Malaysian forces at that time. So a Malaysian reservist soldier comments on my post saying, why didn't you tag in the Malaysian forces? Do we not have a responsibility for this ummah? I thought, how beautiful. Look, the army is not disconnected from the people completely. They are working hard to do that. They are. I mean, I'm not saying they're working hard. They've been working hard for a very long time to do that. But you still can't completely detach them, because those armed soldiers are not coming from a foreign country. They're coming from us. So I'll give you an example. Syria. When the Syrian revolution kicked off, initially people's demands were peaceful. They said, we want to end to the regime. Ashab yurid isqat al-nizam. Famous saying that went across the Arab capitals. The people want an end to this regime, or the fall of this regime. What did the Syrian authorities do under Bashar? They murdered the people. If you remember, every day, 50, 60, 70 killed. Every single day for several weeks. And then some Syrian officers said, we no longer can be complicit in the murder of our own people. And they defected. It was very small at first, but then it became very rapid at one point, where several battalions and generals, in fact, I read a stat, I think it was over 100,000 Syrian soldiers defected. It was actually more than that. And many of them were the officer corps, the ranks of officers, people who had authority. So these people were serving Bashar, they were killing for him, literally killing for him, and then they changed, they shifted. So the same people doing the crimes changed. So are they beyond hope? No. And I'll give you another example. Late 90s, this is before pre-Erdogan, the head of the Turkish forces, and this is when they were what we call, I forget the word they used for this form of secularism, but it was like fanatical secularism. There's another word for it. Yeah, Kemalism, but there was a specific thing about that, you've got more like the French model of secularism. It was ultra-secularist model, where no form of religion should be allowed. So like any hijab in public places, etc., was banned, as people know in Turkey for many years. At that time, the head of the armed forces in Turkey said he has to purge the army every year of thousands of soldiers. In that time, because they were too Islamic. So imagine that time. That's late 90s. Allah Alam where we are now. What are the sentiments of the people there now? And I can give you another example. Early on in the genocide, Middle East Eye did a report that there were Egyptian officers who said that they were angry that they were not given the order to fight and protect the people of Gaza. Officers. So this was like undercover report done of the Egyptian army. And we know that 2 Egyptian soldiers were martyred over a year ago. So there's many, many examples I can keep giving. But the reality is, do we believe they're disconnected from the Ummah, or do we believe that we can still influence them? As soon as you change your mindset that I'm going to use my words in a positive way and not wake up and say, well, the situation is so dire, I can't do anything. I'll boycott, make dua, and give charity. By the way, this is almost like the pillars of Islam in Jordan. I'm not joking. You go to Jordan, you say to them, what can we do? Boycott, give charity, make dua. The most important one is not there, which is Amr bil Ma'ruf Nahy an Munkar, actually commanding good and forbidding evil. In this context, accounting the regimes, accounting the armies, stop talking about the people who are trading, nationalism, all the really important things we've left, and the easy ones. Oh, I'm not going to have Pepsi. Alhamdulillah, I'm not having Pepsi. And I'm going to give some charity from my wages. And I'm going to make dua at the masjid. MashaAllah, all the easy things, the things that are really difficult, I'm not going to do. And by the way, I'm not diminishing those things. I recently closed a bank account. I recently stopped a subscription, and I try to avoid all the main Western brands that support, this genocide. But I can't be stupid to believe that I'm going to liberate Palestine by doing only these actions. To stop at that is unacceptable.
In the future, we see that in Palestine, there are some narrations, hadith, that the Khalifa, the seat of the Khilafah will be in Palestine. What does that mean to us now? Can we actually, because in this really difficult situation, those narrations, how do we understand those narrations?
Yeah, I think that's like glad tidings. It's glad tidings for us at this time, where the situation is so bad. You want to make sure people don't feel defeated and lose hope. The reality, there's many other narrations. There's a narration about the people of particularly Asqalan, and all the historical scholars. Asqalan and Gaza were one, by the way. In fact, if you look at the old map of Gaza, Asqalan is in Gaza. It's not actually outside Gaza. So that hadith talks about how there's people who will stand firm in Rabat against an enemy. I mean, how can anyone not think when they hear that hadith that these are the example of the people today? We know the many examples. Even one brother in Gaza mentions that there'll come a time that there will be people who will be more committed than, like, I can't remember the number of Sahaba, maybe it's 50 Sahaba, I'm paraphrasing. But, again, you see this kind of level of taqwa and resilience now. And the example of, as you say, that the Khilafah the seat of power, its capital will be in Al-Quds, is a glad tiding. But the problem with the glad tidings that I find, which I try to not push too much, is people are already fatalistic. They already love saying the end of times will not come until this. But by the way, all I'm going to do is wait for that time now. That's like example of Muhammad al-Fatih when he opened up Constantinople. He could have said, what, such a lovely hadith, isn't it? Imagine he didn't work towards it. Imagine he didn't prepare the army and think of how he was going to liberate it. And he was just going to say, such a lovely hadith, it's going to happen. Alhamdulillah, it's going to happen. Or the Sahaba, that when the Prophet said there'll come a time where you'll not fear anything. Now this was a time when they were very fearful of being weak and powerless. And the time that you will not fear when, I think someone moves between two cities in Yemen. I can't remember the two cities, so I don't want to mention them. But that time came. But imagine the Sahaba said, we're not going to work towards it. Just such a nice hadith. So I think for me, the problem we have is we almost love to talk about these prophecies and these glad tidings as if they absolve us of our responsibility. When in fact, it should be the opposite. It should be like, okay, I want to be part of those people that realize that. So like people of Gaza are the ones who say, we'll take it all on. We're taking all the difficulty, the killing, the starvation, the bombing, and we're still staying strong. But alhamdulillah, you guys are talking about the glad tidings as if we're not suffering here. So yeah, that's all my point. Not to diminish it in any way. I think it's important to have that and to not lose hope. But unfortunately, I find too many people resorting to talking about the glad tidings when really they should be talking about their role.
Inshallah. I think we've been going on for like an hour and a half now.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. Do you want to make any closing remarks, or should?
I mean, look, you could talk about this subject and other subjects all day, all night, really. I think it has to be turned into some real action and be creative. I think creativity is lost. I gave 2 examples in khutbah recently about how, and this actually came off the back of an interview I did with a brother, where he was talking about boycotting and not investing in firms that are complicit in genocide. And at one point, he said that a lot of people criticized him and said, what's the point? You know how big their budgets are. You know how big their investments are. Your investment as a Muslim community is like 1%. And he says something really, really powerful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran generally refers to the minority as being the successful ones. And generally the majority are the ones who are lost and who do not have knowledge and who are not believers and who are not committed in many, many different forms in the Quran. But the minority is almost always talking about them as the few. And subhanAllah, what he said is, I have to account myself first. What's the point of me saying I'm not going to do it? My money's still being spent in the wrong way. My actions are still not being done only because I'm saying, the majority are not doing it, so I'll just join them anyway. Actually, be part of the minority. It is an incredible small group of people. Why do you want to be with the majority? The majority are usually the ones who follow like sheep, who don't really think, who are just worried about their next holiday, who are just worried about their next business move. They're the majority. The minority, they're the ones who are going to be special. So why don't you want to be part of those small group, select group of people who do something special? And that made me think of two events that happened in history. One event was the boycott. The boycott was something, I'm talking about the boycott at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. During the boycott, we know that the people suffered a lot from the Muslims and from those of the family of the Prophet ﷺ. And they were left in this valley. Who stopped the boycott? It wasn't even Muslims. What was amazing is that they were all non-Muslims at the time. But they did something so clever. They were creative. They said, look, we're a small group. We're not going to have a massive influence. It was like almost a collab on social media. If you want to give it a modern day twist, imagine you go, okay, we're going to go to the Kaaba and we're going to say, one person's going to say it, then another person's going to say it, another person's going to say it. You're going to change the public opinion now because they think it's a collab going on here. And they go, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. Why are we doing this boycott? This is really bad. And they shifted public opinion. And then we know that the Prophet ﷺ had wahi, that the agreement was actually eaten up, except for the words Bismillah. And they opened the Kaaba and confirmed, and they ended the boycott. I think it was 5 or 6 non-Muslims who brought an end to the boycott. So even when I see these pro-Palestinian non-Muslims doing so much, actually I see some relevance there, that even non-Muslims can take a stance for humanity. So what if a Muslim? And then another example, and people don't like giving these examples. I feel really annoyed about this. We have one of our great examples in our history, and we never talk about him as Sunni Muslims, Hussein radiallahu anh. And I feel so strange. Why don't we talk about him? Because we're so scared that we're going to be somehow aligned to a view that's not the view of the Sunni majority. Hussein radiallahu anh was a martyr in Karbala. There's no doubt about that. Every source accepts that. But we don't like to talk about him. And I can prove that. Tell me the last time you went to a talk that was about Hussein radiallahu anh. Even if you did go to one, it'll be 1 out of 100. But we will talk about all the great Sahaba. But we're almost fearful that if we step into that territory, something bad's going to happen. I don't. I have no problem. So what happened? I just want to give one example that happened at the time of Karbala. At the time, we know that there was 73, I believe, 73 who marched towards Kufa. Because Hussein radiallahu anh believed he was going to get the support of the people of Kufa. He was betrayed. But on the way, what happened is a general was sent to go and stop him. And his name was Hur. I can't remember his full name. Hur. He was sent to stop him. And he went and they stopped him. Initially it was very amicable. They spoke and they discussed and they even prayed together. And Hussein radiallahu anh read the salah and they shared their water, etc., etc. But then Hussein said, okay, let me go. Basically, if you're not going to let me march to Kufa and I'm not going to get the support, then I will back down. Basically, I can't do anything. But he doesn't have the ability to challenge this authority of Yazid and his generals in Kufa. So he wanted to back down, but they said, no, you will not be allowed to back down. And they essentially forced him into a position where he was forced to fight. Now, Hur does something at that time, which a lot of people don't know. Imagine, he's now he was ahead of 1,000 soldiers at the time. But by this point, the actual generals came to the battlefield, there was at least over 10,000. He takes a decision which is in the minority, but at least he was remembered on the right side of history. He takes himself and 30 soldiers and they join Hussein radiallahu anh, and all of them were martyred. All 100 were martyred. But the minority, that means just 1%, the maximum was 1% stood on the right side of that position in history against at least 10,000 soldiers who unfortunately stood not only on the wrong side, they killed the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ, of the Ummah. But it was prophesied anyway. This is part of our history. It was going to happen. So it just made me think, Hur means free. He was free of these allegiances that were wrong. And that's what we need. We need people to be free of these allegiances that are wrong today. So both the non-Muslims have shown us that they could take a right stance, and the Muslims can take a right stance. But we have to accept that we're going to be in the minority. And that's a hard thing to swallow for a lot of people. But why are other people not doing it? Why are there not people speaking up? Well, Allah gave you the answer. You're going to be in the minority.
That's a powerful message. And if those watching can take anything from it, is we don't know what kind of influence we have, and after watching this, we should share this with anyone we know, whether it's family members. We don't know what, or friends, people in our circles, we don't know what kind of effect it may have with them or who they are linked to. or we may be the person watching this, you may be someone that's very well known in the community, have a big following on social media. And as Brother Amar has outlined, part of that call is we need to get this message to the right people. At the end of the day, the result comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He may change the heart from the least likely of people. So it's important, even at the end, we share this podcast with anyone we know, all our contacts, our family members. And thank you for listening to our podcast. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.